What is up, fellow thermonuclear AFers? I am Dan Favale coming at you with another NBA team look ahead. We are on to the team that was my title pick for 2 consecutive years running, the Phoenix Suns. That means I had to bring on the Timeline Podcast, Mike Vigil. Please follow him on Twitter at The Protected Pick. He's a great follow. If you don't follow him already, that's weird because he has like 1 million followers at this point. So head over and follow him. And then also listen to, subscribe to, follow the Timeline Podcast. One of my favorite podcasts to listen to. They are in my regular rotation. He and Sam Cooper do a great job. You can follow that podcast at the Timeline Pod, spelled exactly as it sounds. I have many questions for Mike. None, though, are more important than this one. How the heck are you doing, man?
You know, Dan, at this point, I don't know that it would feel like a season is actually starting without this podcast that we're doing right now, which is like, it's like part of my off-season rotation now. I go through you do free agency, the draft, all of that, and then HardwoodKnocks, and then the season starts. Like that's like part of what we do now. So I'm doing good. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, I really appreciate it. And as you mentioned that, this is the 3rd year. I think this might be the first time we're doing it solo without Sam, who cares more about visiting Victor Wembanyama than coming on this podcast or whatever. So I love that you keep coming back. It means a lot. And the other thing I'll mention really quickly too, I do feel like the honeymoon phase, because you and Sam have been ultra nice to me in this podcast. And then I think relative to national media, I've probably been higher / out in front of the Suns, even before they were really good. And this year they're not going to be my title pick. Spoiler alert.
Fair. Yeah, and fair.
Now I can already sort of sense like the followers that some of them that follow me because you've maybe said something nice or came on this podcast, they might be ready to turn on me. Just even when I mentioned something about, oh, it's cool. Like Devin Booker, people just want to play with him. First CP3, now KD. And I had some Suns fans mentions like, well, Devin Booker was always voted as an all-star among players. And I was like, well, so was Jamal Crawford, actually wanting to be traded to where he is a little bit different. So I'm worried that that's going to happen. But like I said, the Timeline Podcast, one of the best podcasts in the game, bar none. So thank you so much for coming back. And it turns out we might have a thing or two to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, it's been an odd off season for the Suns. It felt like we were on hold for a few months, and then like everything happened right at the end. But you know what? It is basically the same exact team coming back. That's other than a few minor things, but yeah.
And while I was going through the outline, it's going to take 4 questions to get to pretty much actual basketball stuff. Right. But we have to start with the Sarver situation. He gone, hopefully, which is great.
Yep.
Do you think that makes it less of a distraction heading into the regular season, or is there still the specter of it looming over this team?
You know, it's a good question because like I like to think it would make it less of a distraction. But surprisingly, last year they had, the best regular season the Suns have ever had, 64 wins. And everyone played really well. And the Suns even did that all while having like regular injuries to some of the better players on the team. It's not like they had one of those like outsized healthy years like they had the previous season. It was kind of a normal season when it comes to injuries. Mm-hmm. So, they did a good job of like fighting through whatever distractions could have existed last year. This year, I think it might be a little different in that if they want to make moves, James Jones, like trying to figure out how to navigate their sort of not really being an owner right now. It's a lame duck owner. And, there is somebody that was picked by Robert Sarver, for the record, to be the interim owner,
stupid,
Sam Garvin.
By the way.
Yeah, I know.
Allowed to do that.
It's very bizarre. It's like, what's the point? Like, there's just, and in my opinion, I have to say that before I say this every time, but there's just no way Sam Garvin and Robert Sarver aren't talking about the decisions that are being made at the very least. But like when it comes to Sarver, does he add more money knowing that a new owner might own the team by the end of the season and that's when the tax is calculated? Does he try to not add any more money? Does he care if the team's any good now? Like those are the kinds of things that I wonder how that's going to affect the team. The ideal scenario is that they would be sold within a few months. The most recent thing was a high up executive with the Suns spoke to the employees and said the team could be sold within 6 to 9 months, which is essentially now in the playoffs, basically. So as far as when it happens, ideally sooner rather than later. But I do think there's a higher chance that there's going to be some level of distraction this year than last year, only because there probably will be news coming out this year. Last year, for whatever reason, the investigation took very long. Now we know why. There were hundreds of people with complaints, but we never knew when things were going to happen last year. So it was just kind of a whole season of nothing. And now there probably will be something.
And unless though he's gonna start like cutting costs, like, and it won't be him. Excuse me, it'll be like his.
Sam Garvin is his
Sam
name.
Garvin. I don't know that how much I'd be more worried about the other stuff than like the Sarver situation, because the players aren't out there like playing for their owner anyway.
They don't care.
I could still keep becoming a distraction and a storyline, but mostly for people on like maybe you and I or reporters and people on social media, just because the owners and the players are so like I think we conflate like the two as having a relationship more than they actually do a lot of the time. I am happy that he's going to be forced to sell, though. I said this before we recorded, and I just want to echo, you and Sam killed the coverage of the entire situation on the Timeline podcast. And he's, I won't say he's getting what he's deserved, because he's about to become a billionaire as a punishment. But hopefully, as you and Sam say, hopefully they just get sold to a non-broke boy billionaire.
Exactly. There was no scenario, there was no solution that ended with Robert Sarver being poor. Every outcome of the investigation ended with him being very rich, whether it was owning the team or not. So at the very least, the employees that work for the team no longer have to deal with him this season, or hopefully ever again, because he's going to sell the team. So it was a great solution for the team, and it'll be really interesting to cover. That's sort of a different way of covering the team, but it'll be interesting for us and the podcast to figure out how to cover a new owner when that does come, and how that impacts the team, because there's always a transitionary period that could be a little weird.
Do you expect it to be, or would you hope, let's phrase it this way, would you hope that it would be maybe the like minority owners who step up, or would it be, do you expect it to maybe be some, I don't want to say more random, but just someone to come in from the outside and really just overwhelm with, we've heard about offers in the not like $3, $4, $5 billion.
Yeah. Bill Simmons said like 4.7 or something like that. A very Bill Simmons way of choosing a very random number. But I think a lot of the expectations on who can purchase the team for that much is based on the proximity to Los Angeles and the fact that there's a lot of super rich people in Los Angeles. So from the perspective of somebody who lives in Phoenix or lives in Arizona owning the team, maybe it would be better to have somebody that is a minority owner, like somebody like John Najafi, who grew up as a fan of the team and is a billionaire worth $3 billion, purchasing the team. But you know what? Robert Sarver was from Arizona. He went to University of Arizona. So I'm open to anyone that I think would be maybe slightly less meddling in their ownership of the team, and allow the basketball people to do basketball stuff and not be cheap with the money. So I'm not insane in that I know that we're not going to get like a good person as the owner of the team. Like I would say that I would love to have a good person owning the team, somebody who's not a horrible person. And I know that maybe that doesn't exist at the level of money that it takes to purchase the team, but at the very least, I hope that they're good at owning a basketball team.
Right. I mean,
for our sake,
there's probably a pretty good chance that it won't be a downgrade.
Yes, it's not going to be. Yeah, exactly.
Unless
at the very least
that's involved, then we might need to have another discussion about it.
Well, that's a fascinating one, because he could buy the whole NBA. So from the perspective of a non-broke boy, as we called Robert Sarver, that's the complete opposite end of the spectrum. I think he'd have enough money, but I don't know. I'd have to check my morals at the door at certain points of that season.
Hashtag Big Media has made a lot about Deandre Ayton's demeanor since coming into training camp. He had the clip of him giving short answers. There's also been, I can't remember if it was Mona Shelbourne or whoever reported that he was more so mad at Robert Sarver about the way the contract situation played out. There's also we know the contract situation got awkward. Like he had to go out, get an offer from the Pacers. Are you actually concerned about that at all? Or do you sort of look at this as, well, if Sarver was part of the problem, he's leaving, and his teammates have said nothing but glowing things about his work ethic and game pretty much?
I'm excited to watch him this year, and I'm not overly worried about him as a player outside of, I think, the normal concerns with Deandre Ayton, which are focus related and specifically defensively when it comes to focus. In the 2 preseason games that we've seen so far, and forgive me for reading anything into preseason games because they may not matter at all, But there has been almost no level of focus for him defensively in those 2 games, which has been the case in the past. So that's the thing about Deandre Ayton is it's just trying to figure out how much of this is new and how much of this is just the normal Deandre Ayton thing, which is just some level of struggle when it comes to focusing. So I do know that during the media day interviews, every player seemed to talk about how hard he worked in the offseason. And that has not always been the case with Deandre Ayton, where his work ethic has sort of been a work in progress. So for him to spend an offseason working really hard, regardless of the reasoning, and maybe it's frustration related, that I tend to, it's optimism season. That's what we call it on the podcast. This time of year is everyone talks themselves into everything. So I'm just going to focus on saying, well, at least you worked really hard and let's see what happens. But if there is one place where I'm worried, look, ultimately the stuff that he does defensively, the effort stuff, the extra movement on defense, the extra movement on rebounds, that's what the coaching was like that's Monty in his ear, that's Chris Paul in his ear. And if that stuff starts wearing thin on him, I think those are the places that you might see it. I don't think it'll be offensively.
I also think people probably they exaggerated the whole Deandre Ayton didn't talk to Monty Williams yet over the offseason quote, because I think fans underestimate how much players might be in contact with the organization sometimes before they have to come back. It was weird that he was just like, I haven't talked to him yet, though. That was at least good hashtag content, even if it's not something I'd be overly concerned about.
It was super weird. Yeah. And I think it was weird from both of their perspective. There was a story that sort of exists around the Suns in Game 7 that supposedly Deandre Ayton refused to go in to the game at the end of Game 7. And there was some altercation between Monty Williams and Deandre Ayton, where Monty appeared to feel like Ayton let the entire team down in that moment, regardless of the score. And, I think there was some frustration between both parties there. And rightfully so, I think. That's kind of not a great moment for the team. Mm-hmm. But I don't think there's any reason to believe that neither of them can get past it. I think they'll be fine.
I have other questions on Deandre Ayton, but let's get to the final extracurricular topic, we'll call it. Jae Crowder is on the team, but he's also not on the team.
Yeah.
Has his value been nuked by now? A lack of leverage, and then you had the questionable play to close last season as well. And also sort of just a follow-up to that, is it a big whiff on their part if they let this drag out into the season, he's on the roster but not with them? Or is it maybe more so a symptom of they were at such a standstill because of the KD situation over the offseason?
Yeah, well, I have a couple thoughts on that. I will say that, well, first of all, I like Jae Crowder. I think
he's good for this team. Like, he was super impactful.
I think he's really good, and I think he does things that maybe some fans just don't notice because it's not super obvious. I think he's really smart defensively, and he brings an edge to the Suns that, every contender needs an asshole, I like to say. And he was that guy on the Suns. The Suns kind of needed a guy that was like that. And without him, I think there's going to be something missing from the team, defensively and just sort of attitude wise. Now, as far as, his value, it's kind of a complicated scenario with him because he's he has 1 year left on his deal. And he appears to be willing to exercise some level of control over his future, right? Meaning that if we said, hey, we're going to trade you to the Kings, he might say, nah, I'm not, I won't play there. Like, I'm not going to do that, or at least resist it as much as possible, which is a complicated scenario with him. But like, when you think about Jae Crowder, what teams want him? It's probably going to be teams on the edge of contending that want somebody like him to be on the team. The Heat, the Celtics, the 76ers, teams like that. And, or I can even see like the Knicks wanting somebody like him. The Cavs, I think, is an excellent example. He fit right into their starting lineup and make them amazing. And so I think from the perspective of the teams that want him, I don't know how much it changes that. And I actually think maybe carrying him into the season is not the worst case scenario, only because after the first few games, maybe there's somewhat of a wake up call for some of the teams that are in that position where they say, oh no, we need somebody like this right now. And maybe at that point they'd be willing to give up a little bit more than they were before. It's unfortunate, I think, with the Jae Crowder situation. For those who don't fully know or understand what happened, it's essentially that he wanted an extension or he wanted to start, right, to build up his value, because this contract he's going to get now will probably be the last contract of his career. He's 33 years old, turning 34 this season. And the Suns are starting Cameron Johnson as of right now, and they didn't want to give him an extension because the amount of money the Suns have on the books in future seasons is kind of insane, especially if they extend Cameron Johnson. So it's a situation where he's kind of looking out for the future, his own personal future when it comes to money. And it still sucks. I get why he's doing it, but like, it is a contract that he signed with the Suns that he's not currently playing on. It's sort of a mini Ben Simmons situation for the Suns, but with somebody who is very, very much not afraid to shoot a 3-pointer in Jae Crowder. But yeah, it's going to be an interesting situation to see played out. I did tell you before we started recording, now that we're recording, he's going to be traded as soon as we're done, probably, but hopefully we have more of a chance to cover it later.
Yeah, and I told you I wasn't going to put my phone on Do Not Disturb, and then my phone started blowing up 3 minutes into the podcast with totally unrelated shit. So it is on Do Not Disturb now. So he will definitely get traded. How do you envision them approaching the Jae Crowder actual trade when it goes down? I think, look, if it's in the middle of the season, maybe it's a little bit different. And like you said, that could help them. It definitely hurts the on-court product, but you let other teams not just develop needs, but there might just be other teams that implode. And there could then be teams that, if they're going to come in as a third or a fourth party, and it just opens up possibilities. But like, is it just going to be sort of this nondescript, like Jae Crowder and maybe another salary for someone? If you're the Suns, would you consider moving him? Where, like, if when you're talking about some of these teams, like if it's the Heat, their primary asset is draft equity. So would it be something like that? Or could you see the Suns maybe going forward as part of a larger deal where they're the ones including draft equity? Or the fourth question to that is just, do you not see the Suns thinking like that just because, like, let's face it, do you really trust it not to implode in Brooklyn this year? Like, if the prospect of KD in January or February is on the table, you have to at least account for that, like 3 to 8% chance or whatever it might be.
I think you just nailed it there at the end, in that the Suns, I think they're in this weird middle ground. I've been calling the Kevin Durant situation for the Suns the Kevin Durant hostage situation, because the Suns were basically held hostage with an inability to do anything until they found out what the end of that was. And I think that hampered them this offseason into doing other things that could have helped the team. But now they're in a position where, now that Deandre Ayton is signed, he can be traded after January 15th with his approval. He has to approve the trade, which, based on media day, you can kind of think that he might approve a trade if the Suns are like, hey, we
won't veto anything that comes across his desk.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe if it was, I don't know. Maybe he wouldn't veto anything. I don't really know. He's got his money now. So I'm not sure what his priorities are beyond that. But I do think the Suns are in a position where they don't want to get somebody that's unplayable this year, but they're hesitant to attach significant future assets, because even if you take Kevin Durant out of the equation, the Suns have all of their future draft picks right now, meaning they can trade up to 7 or whatever it can be if you include swaps. They have Mikal Bridges under contract. They have Deandre Ayton under contract. They'll likely sign Cameron Johnson to an extension. And then they have Devin Booker and an aging Chris Paul. Now, when you're talking about the future of this team, if they have to pivot in some way to replace the star power that Chris Paul brings, they probably want to have as many assets in tow as possible to make that possible trade. Kevin Durant being one of the obvious players that could potentially come on and fix the team. We talk about Shai Gilgeous-Alexander from the Oklahoma City Thunder. I know they hate it when anyone talks about the potential of him being traded, but we all saw that Wemby game, or those 2 Wemby games. How much do they really want to win at this point? They clearly want him as a player. So, if there are any possibilities of the Suns making a significant move for a potential superstar or at least star level player, I think the Suns are so conscious and aware of that they're trying to navigate the position of holding on to assets for something bigger, while still not making the team worse. I think right now the Suns are just worse than they were last year. There's no way around that. And so it's a complicated situation for them. I do think there might be a willingness to trade this year's pick, like just this coming pick, and then just nothing beyond that. They don't want to necessarily part with anything beyond that. But we'll see, because it's tough. Like they basically had a player asking to be traded at a time where only Utah Jazz players were available. And what do they want Jae Crowder for? They definitely don't want him. And so they're in a tough position to make a good move. And I honestly think the Suns are probably going to be willing to hold on to Jae Crowder, even if it means him not playing, until they get something of value for him.
Is there even a non-zero chance that maybe he does suit up for this team again if it drags out?
Cameron Johnson just hurt his thumb in a game. Right. In like the second preseason game, 4 minutes into the game, Cameron Johnson sprains his thumb. He's out probably for the rest of the preseason. I'm not sure how much longer than that. It depends on the severity of the injury. There's not a lot of depth on this team right now. The bench is pretty bad. And Jae Crowder, top 6, top 7 player on the team, just taken out of the rotation entirely. Yeah, that's a significant portion of the talent on this team. So I think there's a small chance, but like if you ask Jae Crowder, he seems to think there's zero chance, and I think he has a little more control over it. Summer makes he could be fined though. Like they could fine him if he doesn't play, if they want him to play and he doesn't. So they have some level of the ability to like negotiate with him on that, but we'll see. I would be surprised if he does play.
So knowing the confines in which you expect them to work, trying to plan around the future, are there any trade targets that stand out to you specifically you'd like to see them prioritize, using Crowder's salary as one of the chips to get said player?
Yeah, I mean, like I was just sort of in the last podcast we had, I was asking Sam, our co-host, and Kellen Olson, who's one of the beat reporters that covers the Suns, if they're at Duncan Robinson level of panic when it comes to the bench right now, and then Duncan Robinson scored 27 points in a preseason game right after. And of course, everyone's like, maybe we are ready for that. Everyone that listened to that podcast, because of the Heat apparently want Jae Crowder. They don't seem to be as infatuated with Duncan Robinson as they were in the past. And it's not a great contract. He's paid like $18 million a year.
Yeah, he is like $20 million a year Garrison Matthews. That is what Duncan Robinson is essentially.
Yeah. That's a good way of putting it. And then like there's some non-guaranteed money at the end of that deal, but it's still bad. Like, in all ways, it's still not a great deal.
It's 4 years left. That's just a long, like the way contracts are signed now, like non-stars aren't on the books for that long normally.
I don't know. He has a great agent. If I were an NBA player, I would hire whoever Duncan Robinson's agent is right now, because that's just a really, really great. In fact, Cameron Johnson should go out and hire him right now until his extension is signed. By the way, one of Cameron Johnson's agents is Devin Booker's dad. So I have a feeling
maybe he shouldn't do that. Then.
Yeah, I have a feeling he'll be fine. Yeah.
Duncan Robinson's agent is Jason Glushin. I apologize.
All right. Shout out to Jason. He's clearly a genius. But so he's just somebody I threw out there. I'm not really infatuated with that. Eric Gordon, I think, is still pretty good. I think it's kind of
year 4 trade for Eric Gordon.
Right, but maybe it wouldn't take a first-round pick at this point, right? Are we at the point where they might do it without a first-round? He just hired a new agent, by the way. He signed with CAA, which is where Devin Booker's dad works and where Devin Booker's agency is.
I was about to say, all you basically told me is that he's either, I guess that, or he's going to the Knicks if he's with CAA.
That's a good point. Yeah, I mean, he'd be pretty good there too. No more Evan Fournier for people who hate him, maybe in that case, but. Matching salary with players that are actually valuable for the Suns is hard, because Jae Crowder was kind of like on a really great contract. He signed for the full MLE money for us for 3 years. Basically,
I remember when he got that deal, I was shocked that that's all he went for.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great deal. Was a great deal for the Suns at the time, but now you're trying to make a trade with him. And Eric Gordon is on the final year of his deal. He makes like $18 million a year.
Unless you win the title. If the Suns are a real contender, unless you win the title.
That's right. He can get whatever he wants. if the Suns, max him for all I care if the Suns win a title. But you'd have to include, Dario Saric or Landry Shamet, which I think a lot of Suns fans are like, well, yeah, do it if it's Landry Shamet. Right. Landry Shamet actually played well for the first time in a year in the last preseason game, but I still like it. The thing I like about Eric Gordon is I feel like he could play. It's hard to find a player in that you want to trade Jae Crowder for that could still play with Devin Booker and Chris Paul on the floor at the same time. because you need a wing, somebody big enough to guard threes or maybe even in some cases guard point guards because Chris Paul can't anymore. And so it's kind of hard to find the perfect fit. He's somebody that could. And I think he would be the primary offensive option on the bench, which has been a problem for this team in the preseason so far. So he's somebody else out there. Beyond that, it's been kind of like I like Harrison Barnes too. I think he would be great. I think he could start for the Suns in Cameron Johnson's spot. And I don't think he's necessarily available now, but that's like the kind of team that you were talking about that could implode 3 weeks into the season. Yeah. And maybe at that point they'd be more willing to part with him. But other than that, it's not an easy task to find somebody right now, especially on the contenders.
Yeah, I have some names I was going to throw at you, but I also needed to ask this. What is, does Sam have, is his obsession or interest in Julius Randle authentic?
Yes.
Or, okay.
I don't get it either.
I understand there's a vision of Julius Randle that I think could be a complimentary player, which is what he would need to be.
It's the Andrew Wiggins of the Suns, basically. Everyone thought it was a joke when Andrew Wiggins was on the Warriors. They're like, wow, he's terrible. He's not going to be great. And then it worked. But like, it takes a lot of faith. It's like blind faith to believe Julius Randle could do something like that.
Yeah, I'm still flabbergasted that Sam was on board with that. So I'll manifest it if I can interest you in a very heavily used Julius Randle, by all means.
It literally got him on Nick's podcast because they were so excited at the idea of getting rid of him for anything. Like they didn't even care what came back in the trades. That's into his credit, Sam's credit. That's why he's interested in it, because it's like you don't have to give up anything for Julius Randle at this point. There was a moment in time, and he brings this up, where I was like, the Suns should trade for Pascal Siakam right now. He has extremely low value. And he did. He was shooting 30% from three over a year ago, came back and had an amazing season. And Sam's whole idea is players reach a nadir in value and then could potentially go up from there. I'm just not convinced Julius Randle is somebody that goes up at this point.
Yeah, and I can't envision him defending like he did in 2021 ever again. Maybe he will, and I'll be wrong. So some of the names I have listed for them and the teams that they're on, some of these teams wouldn't be interested in Jae Crowder, but I think that the players are non-star enough that it wouldn't matter. We know KJ Martin wants out of Houston, and he might be kind of interesting as a guy who comes off the bench for the Suns. I thought this one was, I don't know how I feel about it, but Dylan Brooks in Memphis. Would you be able to stomach the Dylan Brooks experience?
I'm there. Yeah. The offense on the bench was terrible. Like, and I know Dylan Brooks is not like great offensively. I think he thinks he is, and that's actually a skill for him. The thing that I like about Dylan Brooks as compared to somebody like Jordan Clarkson or somebody that is like the only thing they do is bring some level of offensive skill. I think that Dylan Brooks tries on defense. Like, he's not a great defender, but he tries really hard. And I think that's valuable for a team that's competing. You just can't have guys that are zeros everywhere but offense on a team like the Suns. They have to do something else. If they're a good shooter or they find ways to create for themselves and they pass really well, then that's fine, even if they're a bad defender, right? But if you're like Jordan Clarkson and you're a good shooter, or you can create your own shot, but you don't really try on defense and you don't really pass, I don't know that the Suns can get away with that. With Dylan Brooks, I think you can get away with him a little bit more because he tries on defense. And that's like a 1-for-1 swap. You can pretty much trade Jae Crowder for Dylan Brooks based on their contracts right now.
And so the final two names I'll wrap up with, and I think one of these would be if Charlotte implodes, because then I don't think they wouldn't do this swap if they were winning or trying to win, but they also can do it if they're rebuilding.
I'm excited already because I think I know what you can say.
Cody Martin.
Oh, Cody Martin. I thought you were going to say Kelly Oubre.
No, once Cody, I figured you thought I was going there, but once Cody Martin's trade eligible.
I love it.
Yeah, just as someone who I wouldn't want him handling the ball like too much, but he could maybe run some second unit stuff for them, and he's very malleable positionally. I know his 3-point clip has been like all over the place, but it was fine last year. I would love him for this team. And if you're using, it shouldn't take a first round pick to get. I don't even know if it would take, if Charlotte's bad, does it even take Jae Crowder to get him? It might be some pick and then like Saric's salary.
Right.
And the other name I have, because I'm convinced that, I don't want to say they're out on him, but they're not going to pay him. And I think if he gets moved, it's probably for just like this nondescript first round pick plus salary that's not viewed as damaging. Gary Trent Jr. in Toronto.
Yeah. We talked about him too. It's hard to really figure out how Toronto feels about Gary Trent Jr. I think he's
under 6'7", so clearly they hate him.
That's a good point. Well, how long are his arms? I don't think they're that long. But yeah, I think that he offensively would fill a need for the Suns. That in that Cameron Payne has been bad for like 13, 14 months now. And
he was such a good story too in 2021. That's like,
and I'm still hoping for a bounce back. I think there's a possibility where even when he's bad, he's still kind of good. Like it's not the worst player. But I think he would benefit from somebody else being able to handle the ball. And Gary Trent Jr. would absolutely fill a need. He makes what $18 million as well, something like that. Like it's relatively high salary, right?
yeah, so you would need another contract shoehorned in there. I think he's at, I think is it 19? It was 18 something.
Yeah,
And he has a player option that everyone expects him to. He's at 17.3.
Okay, so that makes it a little easier. But I think, when you're getting a guy who essentially is going to play shooting guard for the Suns, Shamet is expendable. So and Shamet, who has a future salary that becomes non-guaranteed at some point, like only some of the money's guaranteed. That's not the worst case scenario for some teams that can just get off of him relatively quickly.
Toronto could also use shooting, especially if they're going to lose. Yeah, like if it was Shamet and Crowder plus a 2023 first, I don't think that's an underwhelming like starting point. And I don't think
that defense would be absurd.
Right.
At that point, you add Jae Crowder to that team. Oh my God. But what are they going to do offensively? They've already been struggling in the preseason offensively.
They would be team fuck shit up on defense though.
I love it. Yeah, I'll watch that. That's for nerds to watch, and I'll watch that.
So let's talk about actual basketball now. This is the single podcast that we've gone so long without talking about actual basketball. I really enjoyed you do the internal development series. You did it again this offseason. It was great. Still waiting for the internal development on Chris Paul to drop, though. Wasn't sure when you guys were going to do that. But you just, I think, recently did the one about Deandre Ayton and with Kellen Olsen. That episode was fantastic. I highly recommend everyone checking it out. And you talked about how he's branched off his offensive game. And I think for people who might not watch the Suns regularly, you guys have been on this. David, 4-point play on Twitter, whatever it is, has been on top of this as well. Just the hook shot being in there, his ability to slip screens, some of the shots that he's making from the mid-range, his ability to sort of have counters once he gets the ball going downhill. What does the next frontier for him look like offensively?
I hope it's in the short roll. And this is sort of year 3 that we're talking about this, but to be fair to him in that regard, he has gotten a little bit better at it every year. But what we saw in the Maverick series is that nobody is afraid to trap Devin Booker on ball screens with Deandre Ayton. They're just going to send 2 guys at Devin Booker over and over and over again. And Chris Paul, not a great off-ball player, is supposedly going to try being better as an off-ball player. More catch and shoots this year. We'll see how long if that lasts. Reluctant. I think he's actually a pretty good catch and shoot player. I mean,
right.
He just doesn't like to do. He's never. I mean, most seasons he averages less than 1 catch and shoot 3 per game in most seasons of his career. So he's just not something he likes to do. But in order to really fix, I think, the problems with trapping Devin Booker, I think Deandre Ayton is probably the key, unless they find ways just to use, and I've been asking for this for years as well, Mikal Bridges as a screener on Devin Booker and use him in the short roll. But I think with Deandre Ayton, if he can catch the ball in the middle of the floor and just attack hard at first, and then find ways to counter when the defense is coming off the corners on traps, meaning passing to Mikal Bridges or Cameron Johnson in the corners, or Chris Paul if Chris Paul is in the corner at any point, I think that would be massive for him. He honestly hasn't shown a ton as a passer. So I think there is some, for anyone who has like doubt in his ability to run the short roll 10, 15 times a game or whatever it's going to need, fair. Because first of all, he fires the ball at 1,000 miles an hour when he's passing it to anybody, including cutters, which makes it impossible to catch. And, but I do think that he has shown more intent when catching the ball, moving towards the rim in this last season, specifically the second half of last season. And in like the Pelican series is the best example of it than at any point in his career before. And if you could start to build more and more and more on that, I think you help the team more than ever before. Other people might say shooting, and yes, that's fair. Other people might say post-ups, and I understand that as well. I personally am not as big of a fan of running too many post-ups to him because I think he struggles with double teams.
Mhm.
But, how's he going to learn if you don't do it? I guess there is an argument to be made for that. I just personally would prefer them giving him the ball in the middle of the floor on those slipped screens for traps and seeing what he can do with it more than any other season.
I'd probably agree with you. And the post-ups volume would make sense if you envision him as just your sort of life raft in non-star minutes if you're going to sit one of Book or CB3, but I don't think they clearly view him in that vein. And so if you can get him doing more just sort of outside in stuff where he's making like more decisions or having to put the ball on the floor more, I think that becomes more valuable for the way that this team is built.
Yeah, we've already seen in the preseason, as soon as he catches it in the post, the second guy is coming, and sometimes it's just like a simple dig, and sometimes it's a hard double, and they're really trying to frustrate him once he catches it in the post. And so far, not great in the preseason. I think he can find ways. He's huge, right? So he can hold the ball above his head and pass the ball away from those doubles. But I think more often than not, it's a turnover before it's an assist. I had this stat on the internal development podcast. Only 8% of his post-ups last season resulted in a potential assist at the end of the play. So not even an assist, just like a shot from somebody else off of a pass, which is just an insanely low percentage off of those. So if you start sending two guys at him, which I think everyone's going to do this year, there's a chance that just stops working really well. And I'm a little concerned about that.
It does seem like the Suns are going to experiment with more on-ball stuff with Cam and Mikal Bridges this year, maybe if only because as of right now, they don't really have a choice. And with Mikal Bridges specifically, I went back and watched every one of his half-court drives. So, like, nothing in transition, no cuts, nothing while he was running. It seems like that part of his game can stall out before the rim, which is wild to say for someone who, relative to position, actually does get to, I think 30% of his shots came there last season, which is high. Is there anything they can do to get him open things up or get him more downhill in those situations? Because I think that would open up his passing game. Maybe he gets to the line more, and that's probably just a pathway to expand his offensive horizons or, again, be confident in giving him more ball handling responsibility.
The Suns love mid-range shots. They just really love it.
I did not realize he shot like 64% on floaters last year, by the way. That is not something that I had caught either.
He shot in general an absurd percentage in like mid-range shots that were like the short mid-range shots, like insanely good shooting from him. And I think for him, that's a blessing and a curse. Mikal Bridges has played, we've talked about this probably every time we've done this podcast, Dan, but he's played every game since middle school. He never misses games. But I do wonder if sometimes that streak, that Iron Man streak, is partially because of his shying away from contact at the rim, because, that hurts.
Right.
And like that could actually lead, that's how Cameron Johnson missed games last year. Anthony Davis is another guy that commonly misses games because of things like that. And I do think, though, that his finishing and his ability to get to the rim when he does, if he added less of a fear of contact, which he seems intent to do in the first few preseason games, I hate to read into it once again, but it's all we have right now. And if he continues to attack in that same way and just not pull up for that short jumper, even if it's a good shot, I agree with you. I think it benefits the team. One, because I think he'll get more calls. And two, I think the defense will collapse more if he does that. And the second counter to that is making the right pass. And Mikal Bridges has always done that. He's just good at basketball. Like every part of the game he's good at. He's good at shooting 3-point shots. He's good at shooting mid-range shots. He's a great finisher at the rim. He's good at making the right passes. Top player and defensive player of the year votes last year. But he just doesn't do offensive stuff enough. He just kind of has to do it more. He has to take more shots, be less afraid of shooting threes, even if they're slightly contested. When he drives, he has to be less afraid of getting all the way to the rim. You talked about him handling the ball more. Running pick and rolls is something I think he could do a lot, but it's hard with the Suns because it's like you're taking the ball out of Devin Booker and Chris Paul's hands when you do that. But and that's how you win 64 games, when you just let Devin Booker and Chris Paul do it. But then you get to the playoffs, Chris Paul is a little bit injured and nobody else can run the offense. So in some respects, you sort of have to lose some games this year by letting those guys make mistakes in order to be better prepared for the playoffs. And I think that's really the biggest challenge that Monty had last year, which I think, they sort of just won games. That's what they did. And then this year, where it stalled out for the second year in a row, I think the offense was a bigger issue. People say you can't defend Giannis in the finals, that too, but I think the offense was a bigger issue. Mm-hmm. So for 2 years in a row, the offense stalled out in the playoffs. They have to find, assuming they don't get Kevin Durant, they have to find some way to let other people create when Devin Booker is taken out of it. And Chris Paul, you can't really count on being healthy the whole time.
Cam Johnson, do you expect him to get an extension? And if you're the Suns, like what would be the number where you're like, okay, well, we're just going to let this go into restricted free agency?
If it gets over $20 million a year, I think you could say that might be too much, but everyone's talking about the cap going up and how big of a difference that makes. And maybe a $20 million a year extension for Cameron Johnson doesn't feel as bad 2 years from now, 3 years from now, as it does right now. The number we continue to use is the Duncan Robinson number, because Duncan Robinson, first of all, he was overpaid and Cameron Johnson is better, which to his agent's
especially on defense.
Especially on defense, yeah. And I think just effort overall. But like if you're his agent, you're going to say, well, Cameron Johnson's better than that. So fair, I think. But, Duncan Robinson is overpaid. So there's a balance there that they have to strike. So $18 million a year, 4-year extension, something like that, I think is like a fair amount, which is like $72 million, I think. Mm-hmm. That's like a fair amount for Cameron Johnson. If you're getting past $20 million a year, maybe you do let it go to restricted free agency. But at this point, the trouble the Suns have had with people being happy with restricted free agency, maybe just give it to him and figure it out later.
Or do they just let it go into restricted free agency to show Ayton that, hey, it's nothing personal. We do it with Cam too, rather than just extend Bridges, Booker, and Mikal Bridges. And
Robert Sarver's not paying that. That doesn't kick in till next year. So what does he care? He could be like, give him $25 million for all I care, because that's the next owner's bill that they're going to end up paying. The one thing I wonder is if they have some level of trepidation to give him an extension, because then he becomes poison pilled. For any future trades if they end up wanting to trade him this year, which I'm not saying that they do want to trade him, but in talking about the Suns keeping their options open, that's one of the things that could keep their options open by not extending him now. It's an unfortunate situation for Cam, and I kind of hope they do, even if that does complicate things when it comes to making trades.
Are there any concerns you have about him moving into the 4 spot, either defensively or as a rebounder? And what does, just to latch on another question to it, when Monty talks about him getting more on-ball responsibility or getting more offensive responsibility, what do you anticipate that actually looking like?
Yeah, yes, I have some fear. I think the defense is just going to get worse. Now, having said that, I think they could have basically the best offense in the NBA, that single lineup, because if Cameron Johnson plays like he did before he was injured in the Knicks game last year, which is essentially shooting 45% from 3 on 6 attempts a game, with the starters, if he ends up being like that, I just think this offense is going to be absurd. Defensively, if teams have multiple I think the biggest thing that the Suns have, I'll put it this way, I've been saying it over and over again, their biggest versatile skill that they had last year was they had 2 offensive stars and 2 players that could guard 2 offensive stars in Mikal Bridges and Jae Crowder on their starting lineup. So what that meant is if a team didn't have 2 guys who can guard 2 offensive stars, the Suns were going to kill you. And the Suns on the other side of that had the ability of guarding teams that had Anthony Davis and LeBron James, for example. Now they kind of don't. And it makes it just a little bit harder to figure out the matchups. Chris Paul basically can't guard point guards anymore. So that means Mikal Bridges is often guarding point guards. So if there's another offensive star that's bigger than a point guard, it has to be Cameron Johnson at this point. And as much of an effort as Cameron Johnson puts in on defense, he's not Jae Crowder, and he's nowhere near as strong as Jae Crowder was. So I am a little worried about the defense. I do think the offense is going to be, once it clicks, I think it's going to be beautiful to watch. And I think they're going to be really, really great offensively. Now, as far as you're talking about the bigger role that he takes on offensively, I think I have a feeling it's going to be Mikal Bridges more than Cameron Johnson, for the record. But I think in transition, I think that the Suns were, I think, 8th in pace last year. I have a feeling that's going to go up even higher, because I think that it's not always going to be Chris Paul or Devin Booker dribbling it down in transition anymore. I think it's going to be basically everyone but DeAndre Ayton in the starting lineup. Whoever gets the ball off of the rebounds, the person closest to the outlet pass is just going to run it as quick as possible. And that means Cameron Johnson handling it in transition, Mikal Bridges, Devin Booker, and Chris Paul in some cases. And I think that's probably going to be the first thing we see, him taking more of the ball handling responsibilities in transition. Beyond that, I think there's some elbow sets, that what we call elbow sets for the Suns, where Devin Booker is sort of curling around screens at the free throw line, where you just put Cameron Johnson in those sets. And now Devin Booker's in the corner, who's an excellent corner 3-point shooter, or just catch and shoot 3-point shooter in general. And you just let the person who's moving on those plays be Cameron Johnson a little bit more, and use Devin Booker and DeAndre Ayton's off-ball gravity to find ways for Cameron Johnson to score that way. And I think they're going to do that a lot more, which they were able to do last year with him on the bench.
Chris Paul, you mentioned him a couple times now. Age 37 season. We saw how Dallas targeted him in the playoffs. I know he was banged up, but is there any concerns about just the age, the fact that he can't defend point guards anymore? And is this, I think I asked you guys this last year. He's been vehemently against this, but could we see like a maintenance program for age 37 CP3 at all to try to keep him fresh for the playoffs?
I hope so. The Suns have if Cameron Payne continues to be bad, Cameron Payne also hurt his finger in the last preseason game. But if Cameron Payne continues to be bad, the lack of depth at that point guard position is bleak. Yeah. If you even say Cameron Payne's bad, it's just literally Chris Paul, who played more minutes last year than he did in the previous season. And if you find a way to maybe a Jae Crowder trade could include Cameron Payne, and they're trying to get a different backup point guard. I've even made the case for Mike Conley on our Discord, where I'm like, what if we just trade for Mike Conley and say, screw it, backup point guard is more important when you have Chris Paul than other. Let's just put Mike Conley in it and see how that goes. And then he's expiring. We'll figure it out later. But it's to the point where I hope he does take some time off. But Dan, I'm going to be honest with you. I saw the Adelaide 36ers targeting Chris Paul. That did happen in that game. They ran their offense on trying to target Chris Paul. And I think Monty Williams has a challenge of trying to figure out ways to mitigate that, where you're not switching Chris Paul onto players as much. The Suns were so good at switching in previous years, but he's old now. You can't count on what he did previously to continue. And beyond that, we're talking about Mikal Bridges, Cameron Johnson, DeAndre, and all of these guys taking more of the offensive responsibility, because the more and more your offense is predicated on a 37-year-old point guard, the bigger challenges you're going to face if he gets banged up later in the season. So I think it's a concern. I think the fact that they were so in on Kevin Durant is not a coincidence when it comes to that concern. And I think that as far as assets and trades later, they could do something to address that concern.
We've already mentioned this a few times now. The bench is caps lock rough here in Phoenix at the moment. And so I have an agenda with this question. Are we going to see any actual Devin Booker at point guard lineups? Not ceremonial, well, he's the primary ball handler anyway. Yeah. They only did that for 183 possessions last year. They had a 127.3 offensive rating, which is very high. Yeah. And it's also a way of, you stagger Chris Paul and Devin Booker anyway, but in theory, if you're looking to get more developmental reps for 8 non-ball doing things, or even Mikal Bridges doing things, like staggering your stars even further and giving Booker some more solo time might be a way to open that up. And if the answer is no, let's just move on, because I don't feel like crying on this podcast.
No, I hope so. I really do hope so at this point. I actually think some of the moves they made in the offseason point to the ability to do that. Even somebody like Josh Okogie, who, he can guard point guards, but maybe shouldn't have the ball in his hands at all or ever. Ideally, poor Josh Okogie, but he can't shoot. He's just a bad shooter. But if you put him in a point book lineup, as we like to call it, then he could take a lot of the defensive responsibility of a point guard. Devin Booker can still do what he normally does on defense and then run the offense. But look, I understand why the Suns were so intent on bringing a good point guard to play with Devin Booker. I think Devin Booker is such a great off-ball player that it really helps him a lot. And I also think when you have DeAndre Ayton on the team, Like, you need a great point guard to help set up Deandre Ayton as one of the better finishers in the league. But the last time we really made a real concerted effort to play Devin Booker at point guard, everyone else on the team sucked.
Right.
And at some point, try it with good players. You know, like every
novel concept.
Every stat we have for Devin Booker when it comes to like playmaking stats and running the offense is good. Like, none of them point to reasons you should stay away from it at this point. You know, all of the touch stats that Suns fans like to bring up, where he averages the most points per touch of any player in the NBA, all of those stats point to him having the ball more means the Suns are playing better. Not to mention the most important stat, which is Chris Paul's 37 years old. And at some point, we're facing a future without him. And once you start facing a future without him, you don't want to get to the point where Devin Booker's not used to that. I think they got to do it more. They just have to do. And I think what they're worried about at this point is exactly what we saw in the Mavs series, is just completely loading up the defense to guard Devin Booker. And that's good. Make them face that more in the regular season so that they're more prepared for that when the postseason comes, because that does not need to be their downfall again. And I think defensively, right, you take Chris Paul out of the lineup in that Mavs series, not to make everything about the Mavs, but take Chris Paul out of the lineup in that Mavs series, put anyone else in, and their whole system of attacking Chris Paul over and over and over and over and over again falls apart a little bit. And you have at least a slightly better advantage defensively at that point.
The other thing I'll point to with the Book at point guard lineups, I still think he's an underrated passer. When people say, like, most of his passes might be reacting to the defense, but there's a feel for the game. Like, he can make these intrinsic passes, and the passes he makes, regardless of how you want to classify them, they fucking matter. And one of the stats, I don't cite too much because it's just too much to work through, but I'm going to make you sit through it, is assist to pass percentage adjusted, which is the percentage of passes by a player that are assists, free throw assists, or secondary assists. And so you look at last season, among anyone to make 100 passes, there are only two players who ranked higher in this metric, Trae Young and Chris Paul. And Devin Booker has also ranked in the top 5 of this metric for 3 years running.
Yeah.
So, like, let's have more confidence in Devin Booker, the playmaker, too, because it's clearly worked when you've given him, as you said, better players.
His turnover rate went down last season as well. He had one of the best years of his career as far as turnover rate. And I do think that if you look at this, just the percentage that players shoot off of Devin Booker's stats, even compared to Chris Paul, they're way better. Like, essentially every player that receives a pass outside of Deandre Ayton, who nobody is better at setting players up at the rim than Chris Paul.
Right.
But outside of that, when you're looking at shooters, every player on the Suns shoots better off of passes from Devin Booker. And I think it's clear why. The defense collapses on Devin Booker so much more. And I think that means putting the ball in his hands a little bit more, I think, would benefit the team. And I think people don't know this because nobody was watching the Suns when they were bad. But before Chris Paul got to the Suns, Devin Booker averaged 6.8 assists per game, which is at the time basically the most for shooting guards in the NBA. 6.8 assists, that's absurd for a player who was not the point guard. And that was with Ricky Rubio on the team.
Right.
So it's not like he had nobody to share the ball with. It's just Chris Paul is such a vortex when it comes to playmaking that he sacrificed in order to allow Chris Paul to do it. And at some point, as Chris Paul ages, that sacrifice needs to go the other way.
It's wild how far the discourse between me and the Timeline podcasters have come on Devin Booker. I think my first ever interaction with Sam was years ago when I had Jason Tatum ranked above Devin Booker in something when I used to write the NBA 100. And then this year, though, while it's become a collaborative thing with Bleacher Report where I just write blurbs for it, and it's not out yet, so I can't spoil the number, he finished higher than I expected. And I think you guys will be happy. But I also thought it was too low, and I went on a passing rant about him to where I think, in the words that I was allotted, by the way, because I think he's just been in this realm of I think a lot of people haven't recognized, like, oh, DeMar DeRozan's been like one of the best pick and roll passers in the NBA for almost a half decade now. And I just feel like Devin Booker, specifically off collapses or just in terms of throwing passes that matter or that lead to scoring opportunities, he still doesn't receive enough credit for that.
Right. I absolutely agree. And I think it's something I've been on Twitter and YouTube is the way that he uses his eyes to fool the defense, looking away, sending passes without looking, no look passes, stuff like that. He's really a high level playmaker. And I just think he doesn't have the ball enough for casual fans to really see the levels he can get to.
So when I was listening to, granted, you and Sam talked to Kellen about something other than Deandre Ayton, but a lot of that podcast was spent about Landry Shamet. Are you as out on Landry Shamet as Sam is?
No, I mean, no, I'm not. I think, we were talking about Dylan Brooks earlier and trying hard on defense. And I think Landry Shamet had his worst season shooting last year and probably his best season on defense. And so if he can find a way to bring back his shooting, like his shooting percentage, I don't have it in front of me, but I can, from memory, I'm just going to say this. His shooting percentage when having 6 feet or more of space at the 3-point line went down like almost 7%, which is that's not a normal change.
No.
So I think you can sort of read into maybe something else was going on, some sort of just distractions or something personally, or some level of injury or something that caused that to change, because it's just such a dramatic change year over year. 3-point percentages are hard to, sometimes they're just weird year over year. It's not predictable entirely. Look at Duncan Robinson, who we were just talking about last year compared to the year before. But he's not untouchable. I'll tell you that. If you can find an upgrade for Landry Shamet, you absolutely should. But it's optimism season. I am trying to be optimistic about Landry Shamet having some level of a bounce back year, because every other year offensively he was better. So I think there is enough evidence to at least think, okay, last year maybe that was an outlier and he can get back to what he was before that. He also just had an amazing game in preseason, so like optimism season is kind of peaking for Landry Shamet right now, and my hopes are higher.
The Suns could also just use someone who gets up 3-pointers, and Cam Johnson moving the starting lineup I think will help some of that, but they could use someone who is just like unconscious with his volume. And I looked it up while you were talking to. He went from 42.9% on threes when defenders were 6+ feet away to 38.2. So that was quite a steep drop.
Yeah. So not as high as I thought, but higher than you would think as far as changes in that percentage. It seems to be pretty high. And if you look at previous years, they were all basically over 40 when it comes to that amount of space.
So the secondary front court rotation feels oddly crowded and unimpressive. Who is getting squeezed out of here? It seems like Monty's really high on Jock Landale. Does that mean Saric is kind of, once he's full bore, he's not really going to be used that much? Are they actually going to try him at the 4? Are we not going to see as much Ish Wainwright as we would like to as a result? How do you see those things shaking out?
My prediction for you, Dan, is that you're going to love Jock Landale. That's my prediction for you. Because first of all, they love him. Like they just they can't stop talking about him, whether it be the players or the coaching staff. They're just all in on Jock Landale, which I didn't anticipate. I actually thought there was a chance that Jock Landale would be after Biyombo in the rotation.
That was my expectation as of like 2 weeks ago. And then Monty basically put in the MVP vote for him around then. So
well, yeah. So when I'm talking about after Biyombo, I mean Saric, then Biyombo, then Jock Landale.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So instead of that, because Saric was a center last year, instead of that, what we've seen so far, Jock Landale number 1, Saric out of the rotation entirely for the first game of the preseason, which is obviously why they lost. And I think that the injury to Cameron Johnson sort of forced Saric back into the rotation. He played both power forward and center for the Suns in the second preseason game against the Lakers, but Jock Landale was still the primary backup center in that game, and he was awesome. I think he had like 14 points in 15 minutes and a bunch of offensive rebounds. He made 2 threes. He kind of looked like taller Saric in that game, which is kind of nice to see. Sam, I think, really put it succinctly online in that Jock Landale was kind of the middle ground between Biyombo and Saric, in that he can do some of the stuff that Saric did, but he's a lot bigger than Saric, closer to Biyombo's size. And I think for the Suns, if they're thinking Saric can't hold up as a center for the entire season, they're probably right. Because the last time we saw Saric, he was so good at center for the first 3 or 4 months of the season. And then just got worse and worse and worse as the season progressed, as he got a little beat up, I think, at the center position. And it all culminated with him tearing his ACL in the first game of the finals. So I think Saric is just from a pure skill perspective, probably a top 6-7 player on the Suns right now. So they have to find ways to get him on the floor. If that means playing a power forward, which I don't necessarily like.
I hate that idea, by the way. I'm not thrilled about it.
But it's Torrey Craig or it's Dario Saric at this point. So I'm like, maybe it's okay if it's not. Torrey Craig hasn't been overly exciting either. So, once they trade Jae Crowder, everything could change for the record. So it might even include Dario Saric at that point. He might not be on the team beyond that. But I like Dario Saric, and I think they need to find ways to get him on the floor. He's smaller than he's been before on the Suns, at least. Like he appears to weigh less. Meaning maybe there's some less stress on his knees, on his legs. Maybe he can move around a little better at power forward. I just think with Dario, if you're parking him in the corner, you don't have him on the floor, basically, because he's not Cameron Johnson. He's not this Claymore waiting to explode as soon as the ball touches him. He needs to be in the action. He needs to be setting the screens, catching the ball, making the passes, pitching it to another guy to screen for them. Like those little things that he does really only happen a lot when he's at center, and they happen a lot less when he's at power forward. Having said that, him and Frank actually played together well, Frank Kaminsky, when they played together. So Jock can kind of do some of the stuff that Frank does because he can spread the floor, theoretically. We'll see if it actually holds, but they seem to think he can. So maybe there is a version where him and Jock Landale develop some level of chemistry together, and Jock doesn't have to screen all the time. He can kind of spread the floor in the corner, and Saric can still kind of screen in some of those plays. And if that works, I think that's fine. They just need to find ways to get him on the floor, I think.
So where are we at with Ish Wainwright then? Is he not really actually going to factor? I was kind of hoping. Look, I'm at the point where just because Wainwright's hands always seem like they're up, even when they're not facing the ball, I would rather see him playing 4 minutes over Saric at the 4.
I'm not joking when I say they could start Ish Wainwright right now for Cameron Johnson, and I would be happy.
Oh man,
he does so much. He does so much that is just like what nobody else wants to do, which is get hit really hard, reach in, get rebounds. And actually, I believe in his shooting. For the record, I think that his shooting, I think it's gonna be real. I think he can actually get better, and I think he's gonna. I said this last year, and he ended up getting one, but I think he's gonna earn himself a full rotation spot this season. He's currently on a 2-way. Once some trades get made, I have a feeling there's going to be an extra spot, and they're going to sign him to a full contract going forward. But they're probably not going to do it yet. But I think he's great, and I think it's more likely he leapfrogs Torrey Craig than a lot of people realize. And Torrey Craig, I think, is just such an obvious trade candidate, a $5 million expiring deal for a player that's been kind of disappointing since he came back to the Suns. And Ish Wainwright is an obvious replacement there. So I hope he gets minutes. You're talking about him playing at center. They did that so much less than I wanted last year anyway, that they need to find him minutes at forward because they just, I don't know, Monty doesn't like to go small as much as I wish he would.
Who intrigues you more for this team, Damion Lee or a healthy Josh Okogie?
That's tough because it's like, who cares?
Fair enough.
I know what Sam would say, and I'll just say it for him. Josh Okogie. I think that Josh Okogie is like, I just envision minutes of Josh Okogie guarding the point guard and Mikal Bridges having the ability to like be that sort of free roaming safety, which he's never really allowed to be on the Suns because the Suns don't have any point of attack defenders outside of him. So giving Mikal Bridges the freedom to do different things defensively than he has been really had. He hasn't really had that freedom in the last, especially last year, where he was essentially tasked with guarding the point guard every single game or their primary point of attack every single game. Now I think you can have lineups where it's Okogie, but like Okogie is not, he's a bad shooter. Like you're hoping for 32% from 3 when it comes to Josh.
That's aspirational.
Yeah. And it's like lower than his career average. Yeah. So you're I think at least, so you're kind of hoping for that kind of thing from him. So I would say him. And now Damion Lee, I don't know. It's just tough to really, if he can't shoot, Damion Lee, if he can't shoot, he doesn't bring a lot. And he's had up and down shooting over his career. So hopefully this is an up year. And if it is, I think Damion Lee could actually get a lot of minutes because he's just a guy that's going to eat minutes, shoot threes, play okay defense, have long arms, be kind of tall for his size or for his position, and he could play shooting guard, he could play small forward. So there's some room for both of them. But I have a feeling that I wouldn't be surprised if Okogie got significantly more minutes than Lee once the season is over.
I think that what Okogie does is more bankable with the defense. Damion Lee just intrigues me more as an overall player for someone who can move without the ball, and then theoretically his shooting and not being totally cooked on defense against 2s and 3s.
Right. I agree with that, and because we'll see if it ends up being something that Damion Lee, if he can just shoot, what did he shoot 40% 2 seasons ago or something like that? Like that's if he could do that, then there's not a lot of players in the Suns that could do that right now. So
right,
he'll get minutes.
We've reached the cookie quarter portion of the podcast, and I asked this question: does this team have any underrated strengths or weaknesses, or potentially hidden gems or concerns that are not being talked about enough? And if we're going hidden gems, I'm just gonna exclude Wainwright from that, since we already talked about him.
Yeah. I made my prediction about Jock Landale with you. I think you're going to end up I think a lot of the type of people who end up liking backup centers for teams will like Jock Landale. Like, I'm not saying that Jock Landale is going to be a household name, but like you'll see Steve Jones tweet about him or somebody like that does like actual film analysis. And they'll see that. But the other part, I think this is sort of an unfair way to put this, but I think the roster versatility that the Suns have as far as making trades is actually going to matter a lot for this team, whether it be this season. Look, they might just hold out and say, you know what, let's figure it out later. Chris Paul's salary after this year is non-guaranteed. They have the ability of even getting rid of Chris Paul if they want to, just paying him $10 million to go away next year. If they end up, I don't see a scenario where they do that, for the record, but they have a lot of roster versatility that they could use and make trades. And I think whatever we're seeing of this team right now, it's not what we're going to see at the end of the season. I think that's the most likely case. There is the complication of the Suns are for sale and don't really have an owner right now. So if anything holds that up, it's that. But assuming they have the kind of freedom that I hope they do, I think this team could be improved as the playoffs come.
I would agree with you, which makes this next question sort of stupid. But what do you think the 10-man rotation at full strength and as currently constructed should look like for this team? And I'll frame it this way. There very clearly are like, I guess 6 or 7 locks at least. We have Chris Paul, Booker, Bridges, Johnson, Ayton, Payne, and then I guess Shamet is another lock at this point. Yeah. So how do you flesh out like beyond those 7?
Yeah, I think Jock Landale, Torrey, Craig are probably the next 2. So that's 9, right?
Yeah.
And I guess it's up for grabs after that. It's actually kind of an interesting scenario where like the Suns signed Dwayne Washington Jr. as well, which is not like a great signing.
I know Sam loves him.
I mean, he averaged 10 points a game last year. Like, he's a player that can dribble, and the Suns don't have a ton of players that can dribble right now. So there's a chance that Dwayne Washington Jr. finds a way into the rotation. I guess if I had to choose somebody at that last spot, I would want it to be Ish Wainwright, because I think, there's the ability of playing small ball center. And I do think that not having Jae Crowder, having a big, huge, strong guy that can guard big, huge, strong guys on the other team, or even just like eat up 5 fouls at that position, is not the worst case. And he's somebody that, look, I think his corner shooting will be fine. He can't really do much beyond that offensively. But like, there's been multiple times last season where the Suns were losing, and they just put Ish Wainwright in for 15 minutes straight, and they just came back and won. And there's not, I don't think that's a coincidence. He's a different look for the Suns than they have with anyone else. And so if I had to choose, I think I would hope it would be him. I think they're going to struggle, right? They can't play full bench lineups because the offense is terrible on the bench right now. So they're going to struggle even to try to not play their starters too much. So if somebody like Ish Wainwright can prove valuable, I think that'll go a long ways.
When you look at the bench specifically, should fans be annoyed that they didn't go out and burn their mini MLE, or is this actually an instance of, and this is what I struggle with, because I will criticize teams when they don't spend, but you kind of look at how the market played out, and it was, well, who are they going to sign with that money?
Well, there was a Kevin Durant hostage situation, as we talked about. So they had to wait for that to be resolved. And I think they strategically said, we're not going to use that MLE now, because what if we trade campaign? Now we got to use it on a point guard right? What if we trade Jae Crowder? Now we got to use it on a wing. And then everyone was gone by the time that was done. And the one player I think that you could make the case that could have brought value to a team was Dennis Schroeder. And if you remember the reports that came out after Dennis Schroeder signed with the Lakers, it's that Dennis Schroeder chose between the Lakers, the Suns, and another team. So the Suns were kind of in on maybe replacing Cameron Payne basically with Dennis Schroeder at that point of the season. And Schroeder chose to go to the Lakers. At this point, I think Suns fans can be annoyed at this team, but I think as far as their lack of movement on anything in the offseason, but like everyone sort of understands why there was a chance the Suns could get Kevin Durant, and they tried their best to do it. And now they're in a weird position of coming into the season with maybe some players with definitely some players that are unhappy and some roster spots that are not as deep as you'd like them to be. But if there is buyouts at some point of the season and the Suns continue to have the TP MLE available to them, they'll basically have the most of any quote unquote contending team to offer. So somebody like Eric Gordon, if he ends up being bought out, or you can make the case for other players.
That would be objectively hysterical if that's how this ends. Eric Gordon to Phoenix in a buyout after
it would be great. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it could end up, maybe he would take, if the Suns offer him the full MLE, for example, their full MLE, which is like 7 point something million. That's less of a buyout if they find a way to buy him out for less than that with the Rockets. But anyway, they have the ability of signing players later if they end up needing to, and in a buyout. I am kind of glad that they didn't. I looked at the free agent list after the Kevin Durant hostage situation was over, and it was bleak. It was really bleak. And look, maybe they could have used it before that. I understand why they didn't, but it is a situation where the entirety of the Suns offseason was impacted by that, and they're still sort of paying for it. And I think they're going to until the trade deadline, and they're going to have to figure out what they're going to do before the playoffs start. It's, at this point, it's probably your last swing with Chris Paul at this point. Yeah. So if they're going to make a swing with Chris Paul, it's now. And if they don't, they're sort of conceding that that's okay. They're not going to win this year, and they'll pivot next year and figure out something different.
What should be this team's go-to crunch time lineup? It's an obvious question, but do you see the potential for them to futz and fiddle with it at all, depending on the matchups that they're facing?
Well, as long as Deandre Ayton is completely engaged this season, then I think it'll just be the starters, and the starters will close. If Deandre Ayton is somehow not great, or if everyone's worst fear as far as Suns fans comes true, and he's clearly unhappy with the team and not trying defensively, yada yada yada, maybe you could. There were a few games last season where 2 seasons ago, where Dario Saric closed instead of Deandre Ayton, and it was sort of a lesson being taught to Deandre Ayton. But beyond that, I think that it's probably just going to be the starters. There's not really a scenario where it won't be.
It's amazing how long ago that feels, that there were games where Saric was closing and Ayton wasn't, because he just feels like, even though he's flawed, and I think consistency, when we talk about where he could develop the most, that might still be like the single biggest area he can make progress. He's just such like a much better player than those days when we're talking about Saric closing over him.
Oh, absolutely. And, there was this great quote by Giannis about consistency recently. I don't know if you saw this, but somebody asked him like what it takes to be a star player in this league. And he went on this long rant about how it's not about skill. It's not about skill, which, is almost, for some people, maybe funny coming from Giannis, because he's accused of being unskilled.
James Harden was pointing at the TV when Giannis said that.
Yeah. I'm like, Giannis is skilled, obviously. Just watch basketball. But his whole point was about how hard it is to be consistent in the NBA, and how the best players in the world are the ones that are capable of being great on a consistent basis. And I was watching that going, somebody show this to DeAndre Ayton right now. I said, make it his ringtone. Like make it play every time, every day he wakes up in the morning, make sure that's the first thing he sees. Because if Ayton is consistently as good as he could possibly be, he's like a no question all-star. But the only thing holding him back from being that all-star, in my opinion, is his ability to remain focused and consistent on a day-to-day basis.
I would say Monty Williams should text him the video, but apparently they don't have each other's numbers.
So that might be the worst case for Ayton. He'll delete it immediately.
Is there a weirdo, bonkers, quirky lineup you want to see Monty Williams roll out this season?
Oh, that's fascinating. I think all of the non-traditional lineups that I've been thinking about have been with Devin Booker at point guard.
Yes.
So maybe you could say Devin Booker at point guard and Ish Wainwright at center and just sort of fill in the rest. And let's just see like this full Houston Rockets sort of PJ Tucker style James Harden lineups and see what happens with no center and Deandre in that point guard. And I guess you could say Cameron Johnson would have to be in there for shooting purposes. Mikal Bridges would have to be in there for defensive purposes. And that final spot, I think, could be up for grabs, whether if you need
Kemba
offense.
Walker. Yeah.
If you need offense, Landry Shamet. If you need defense, Josh Okogie. I guess you could say.
I'm mad that you took my exact lineup.
Oh, was it?
It was, so you had the 4 of them in there, and I just had Damion Lee listed there.
Okay,
but,
I think that's fair too, because that's like switchability.
Yeah.
That's probably the best version of that. Yeah.
I would. So if you see that lineup at all in the season, if you could please tag me, I'd very much appreciate it.
I will. I will definitely tweet about it if I see it, because it would be like, is Monty gone? Is somebody else coaching right now?
So as we're recording this, the Suns' current win total is set at 52.5, which would be an 11 win. If they miss it, it would be a 12 win drop off from last year. Are you smashing the over or the under on that? And where do you right now? Yeah. Let's assume they don't make any moves, but where do you see them stacking up relative to the rest of the West?
I think the panic about the Suns being bad discounts the fact that they have a bunch of good players still in Devin Booker, Chris Paul, Mikal Bridges, Cameron Johnson, Deandre, and the starting lineup are 5 really great players. Yes, they have depth issues, but they can still make moves to help address that, and that's easier than fixing the top end talent, which they do currently have. But I wouldn't bet on that if I were you, because look, I think they'll win more than that personally. I'd be surprised if they, 53 wins. I'd be surprised if they didn't get at least 53 wins. But is there a scenario where everything goes badly and the Suns kind of have a disastrous season from hell? Yeah, there is one. I don't want it to happen, and I don't think it will. But when it comes to gambling, like, I wouldn't put your money on that definitely not happening personally. That's a stay away, I guess, in my mind.
So this comes to the caveat. I have to go through it again at the same time and do every team because I've smashed way too many overs. So I would take the over because I just don't think 11 wins is a huge drop off in itself, and they would still hit the over if it was just 11 wins off last year's pace. However, I also did pick them to have the best regular season record again because I just thought they were going to be a machine. Now, since then, we've had Ayton's press conferences. We've had the Sarver stuff. We've had Jae Crowder not with the team. And so I would not bet on that anymore. And once you lose Jae Crowder, until you make a trade, one injury just throws you off, even if it's not to one of your stars. Like if it's to Cam Johnson, for instance, that just,
which already happened, by the way.
Right. So that borderline cripples you. But I think I would still lean towards unless you think that CP3 is going to miss like 25 games this year or something, I think I'd still lean towards the over under. Their place in the West, though, is more fascinating because the West it's a the league feels like a bloodbath this year. Maybe Wembanyama clears that up a little bit sooner than we expected, but just like between Golden State, the Clippers and Nuggets being healthier, I am really, really, really high on the Pelicans this year. The Timberwolves.
That's one thing I did bet on, the Pelicans being good.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't believe their over under, by the way, set at like 42.5 as we're recording.
I know. I got it when it was already 45. I was like, dang it, man. I really wanted it at a lower number, but I still bet it, and I'm not even worried about Zion being injured. Like, I still think they'll probably hit it even if he misses time.
So are there like a certain number of teams that you think are just going to be guaranteed to be better than them in the West this season? I guess.
I mean, as far as regular season wins, I wouldn't count on anyone. And I think I speak for all Suns fans in saying at least nobody punched anybody else. Right. Like, that's kind of where we're at. Like, everyone's worried about the vibes for the Suns, but it's like, wow, at least that didn't happen. Now, there is, I think you're right about injuries. I will say, you talked about Chris Paul missing time. The Suns actually won at a higher rate without Chris Paul when he missed time last year.
So he's the problem.
Yeah, aggregators. I think you could say he's the problem. Yeah. No, I wouldn't say that. I just think the Suns have done such a great job of fighting through that kind of adversity last year. And maybe that was sort of an undercovered part of their great season. It wasn't all due to health. It was just they were adapting so well with their depth and their talent. Now you're talking about some of that depth being gone. I think that's accurate. I think that's right. But even Cameron Johnson, when he started last year, in a year where he wasn't good, basically the whole year, he was good when he started. So I don't know. Maybe these players can find ways to fight through that. And, this will be, I think, Monty's biggest challenge when it comes to expectations as a coach, even more than post-finals, because they had more talent post-finals. I think they have less talent right now, which means coaching is more important. But yeah, it's a tough time to try and predict anything that's going to happen with this team.
Yeah, I do think they're going to wind up making a move that's either medium to just huge. And so I would still pencil them in pretty comfortably to like top 4 with top 5 being their floor. But sort of the final thing on this is there any, though, when you're looking at how they need to improve, is there any just one team in the upper echelon of the West that you feel is a particularly bad matchup for them at this moment?
Yeah, healthy Clippers, I think, is a bad matchup for essentially everyone but the Bucks.
If they put that's the matchup where you play Wainwright at the 5.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Right. That's when you kind of have, but like without Jae Crowder, when you're playing a team that has Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, it's not easy to figure out who guards who on that team. And I think at some point you probably end up with Devin Booker guarding a really good player for a whole game. And he's improved. He's vastly improved defensively, but look, that's going to wear him down, like offensively. And he's not Jae Crowder even when he tries really hard because nobody is, maybe we can trade for Draymond Green at this point.
Do we need to add this to the list of Suns concerns, having Draymond Green in the locker room at this point? I don't know.
I think him and Chris Paul and Devin Booker would actually get along really well. I'll be 100% honest. They're all kind of assholes.
And yeah, that's true. Is there anything or anyone about this team that we didn't touch upon that you think needs to be discussed?
I think that's everyone. I can't think of anyone that look, I'll be honest. I think this kind of tends to happen when we talk. I think Devin Booker is sort of the least talked about Suns player at this point because you're just like, he's just going to be good. But like, if he gets a little bit better than he was last year, he's really freaking good. Like that puts him at the top. I don't know what your list says, Dan, and I hope Suns fans don't kill you for it. As far as whatever it says, I know you didn't make it, but whatever it says. But I think
it was. I am not. BR is not a monolith. It was a collaborative effort. But I think Suns fans will be pleased. Actually,
if he's in the top, look, ESPN put him as the 10th best player in the NBA. Like if he's in that,
Suns fans might be pissed off then.
Okay. If he's in the top 10 conversation this year, that will have the biggest impact. You can talk all you want, I think, as fans about role players getting better, but we all know what really matters in the NBA. It's the stars. And if the stars get better, which Devin Booker still has the ability to do, that will have a bigger impact than anyone else on the team getting better.
Yeah, look, the form on his jumper alone screams should be like a 44% shooter from deep.
Yeah,
I'm still waiting for that season to come.
Yeah, last year I think was a nice it was in the right direction, because one thing I'll say about Devin Booker is when looking at his 3-point percentage, you have to factor in that almost like 2/3 of them or more are pull-up threes.
Yeah,
because he just doesn't play off the ball that much. So when you're talking about 38 point whatever he ended up shooting last year, you have to factor in that most of those were pulling up. And when you're pulling up and shooting that well, that's a really, really good 3-point shot. So fingers crossed that still continues or even gets a little bit better. And if he can add back the drives and finishing at the rim that he had in the previous season, which I think he sort of borrowed from those drives to shoot more from 3 this year. And if he can add those back, I think that's how he gets back into that top 10 player of the league conversation.
Mike, this was great. You gave me way too much of your time. You were generous as always. In case anyone skipped the intro, are you able to tell our listeners where they can find you and all the fantastic work that you do?
Yes. At Protected Pick on Twitter. My name is spelled Mike Vigil, so if you pronounce it like that, I won't be mad. But most people
don't you have it in your profile? It's pronounced.
It's in my bio. Yes,
be a little mad
to pronounce it correctly. But like if you're not reading the bio and you just see my name in tweets with the picture of the bag on my head, I understand. But at Protected Pick, you can listen to our podcast, the Timeline of Phoenix Suns podcast. It's a Blue Wire podcast. It's on every podcast app that you have. Follow Sam too. His is at Scooper Hoops. He's a good follow. He's missed on this podcast. It's fun when we do the three man weave.
That one might have been a 3-hour podcast.
Yeah, that's a good point. But that's all I got. Wait, actually, I'm on TikTok now. I should say that. I'm trying to promote that.
You made the plunge.
I made the plunge. I'm trying to. I'm not gonna go at a lot of TikTok creators, but in my opinion, there's not a lot of great basketball content on TikTok right now. And I asked people, is there a Suns account I should follow? And everyone was like, no, there's not. And I'm like, all right, fine, I'll do it.
I don't use TikTok enough because I don't like distilling down clips from the podcast to like a minute. And also they were talking about long form content at TikTok is considered like over 30 seconds.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, all right. But we do have a TikTok at HardwoodKnocks. So go follow Mike on TikTok as well.
It's the same at Protected Pick.
Thank you so much for all of your time. I really appreciate it. This is always a blast. And as you know by now, I will be pestering you again in the future.
I'm looking forward to it.